Welcome to this week's episode of the Compliance Digest, presenting topics on all things compliance related. My name is Alex Krenke, and joining me this week is Michael Kirk, one of the senior sales executives at Quest CE. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks, Alex.
We want to take a quick break from the last few videos we've been doing, which have been talking about year-end stuff, compliance trends to help you wrap up your program, and some best practice tips. Instead, we want to take a focus on the industry as a whole and look at some trends we've been seeing from the regulators themselves. We thought that'd be a nice break. So today, Mike, I just want to overview some of the recent changes that have been happening at the SEC. So just to provide a little bit of background, I want to talk about Mary Jo White, her position as the new chair there, and some of the differences that you can see contrasting her from the previous two chair people at the SEC. So one of the things that stuck out to me that's different about Mary Jo White is her pedigree a little bit. The previous two had worked at the NASD and at FINRA, whereas Mary Jo White has more of a legal background. So do you see any implications from this as she moves forward as the new chair at the SEC, Mike?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to tell at the end of the day. But as we kind of recognized at our recent NSCP conference, was that if you were to not know who the speaker was and which regulatory authority they were actually representing, a lot of her commentary sounded as if she would be better suited inside the FINRA channels, but in fact she was on the SEC.
Right, I would agree with that, and I think that's an interesting point because she's been quoted and recently in the Wall Street Journal as being somewhat critical of the SROs out there. And another interesting point that I wanted to bring up is that while she remains critical, FINRA under Ketchum is sort of moving closer to the investment advisor direction. And what I'm getting at is I'm talking about the fiduciary standard. Recent comments in Investment News has Richard Ketchum quoted as saying, that he would like to see the fiduciary standard move on top of the broker-dealer market as well as the investment advisor market. So in general, what are your thoughts on the fiduciary standard as it applies to both BDs and IAs, and then how do you see this playing out based on Ketchum and White's words?
I actually do think that the fiduciary rule is a great rule, regardless of which hat you wear, even if it is a hybrid role of SEC and BD registration. So it will be difficult to see how this plays out. Perhaps same song, different verse.
And I think the big thing that we're trying to get at is so what? So we've been seeing a lot of discussion coming from both sides of the table, and it's very similar to what we saw a few years ago when Dodd-Frank was coming to fruition, and we were trying to determine will the investment advisors fall under FINRA like they wanted? Will they stay with the SEC? Turned out they're staying with the SEC from what we can tell so far. And from what we can see from White, I think she would like it to stay that way. But with the two talking about the same thing, being the fiduciary standard and how it applies to both audiences, what do you see as being the impact, or is there an impact when we're looking at the future of investment advisors and broker-dealers and compliance?
Yeah, I guess what to expect, we don't know. That's always the name of the game. But I think what we can take from this is it is that time of year where we reflect on what's happened in the years past. We're making plans for the future years. And whether we're told to do something or not, the idea of what is a best practice always seems to enter the picture. And I think whether we're dealing with compliance of one arena versus the other, there is always a concept of what is the best practices and what are the procedures associated with that. And I think it comes to a point of, should we do something to make ourselves better and make ourselves more compliant?
Yeah, so you hit a really good point. We don't know. We don't have the answer right now. This is still really early on in the conversation. It's very similar, like I said earlier, to what we were talking about with Dodd-Frank. But that doesn't mean, like you're getting at, that you shouldn't take the precautions or start planning ahead. It's certainly a slower moving industry in terms of enacting regulations and in making these huge changes, but you'll never get penalized for overtraining or overtracking. So it's just something to keep in mind as you move into next year.
Great point.
Well, I know that we don't have all the answers right now. I don't think anybody does. when it comes to looking at the landscape for investment advisors and broker-dealers, we're certainly seeing some interesting movement between the two markets, and I know that's something that we'll definitely keep our audience apprised of. Mike, I do want to thank you for joining us today and helping to dig into this issue a little bit more and hopefully provide some insight into what we can expect from the SEC in the future.
Thanks, Alex.
And that'll cover it for this week's episode. I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in another couple weeks for another episode of the Compliance Digest.